welcome to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history, heritage and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Rosie Maggs, and she spoke with me about the interwar period, and she also spoke to me about the Historians magazine of which she works at. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you, Rosie, for agreeing to come onto this in the first place. So what is it about this period of history that you're really interested in?
I just find it really fascinating because I feel overlooked. I feel like everyone looks at the time around it, but they never look at that specific time because obviously it's in between two wars. So I feel like there was so much going on, but everyone just kind of only talks about it in the context of like, oh, there was another war brewing. It's like actually a lot going on.
Yeah, I suppose
people use it as for their own aims.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of forgotten about. You kind of go, First World War, that was a thing. Then Summer happened in between, and then World War Two.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, it was its own time frame, and there was stuff going on. Funny enough.
So what things are you most interested in that happened in the in-between time?
I think there's a lot of social change in the kind of interwar period. You know, it's almost like quite modern, some parts of it, and then some parts of it are like, you know, as old as you would expect. And there was a lot going on. I think a lot of people get fixated on America because of like prohibition and gangsters and all that. But actually, there was a lot going on in Britain as well, and there was a lot of, you know, it's like a lot of famous people, the rise of people becoming like socialites and stuff like that is quite prominent in this era, and also like changes to how upper class lived and stuff like that. So because of World War One, a lot of new inheritance tax and death duties were introduced. So for the first time probably in their lives, they didn't have all the money because they were now being taxed on their estates, and it really changed that kind of dynamic between rich and poor. Obviously there was still rich and poor, but it was very different to pre-World War One.
Yeah, and we also know because in regards to a lot of sons going off to war, and like a lot of families had maybe like one or two sons, and they would both go off, and unfortunately they would have no heirs. There was lots of issues in that as well, like who would own the properties afterwards when the heir has died. So I think there was and I think that's probably what Downton kind of tries to cover a little bit in the TV series of Downton.
Yeah, I love Downton Abbey, and it's actually fairly accurate on that kind of those kind of issues. I mean, like estates were going to distant cousins and stuff like that because obviously most people, well, even today, like women wouldn't necessarily inherit the estate. The inheritance was set up, so yeah, it's like suddenly people who didn't realize they were going to be lords and stuff like that suddenly become the lord of the estate, and they've not prepared for it at all, and they really know what's coming for them.
Yeah. Is there any cases or any stories or anything that you've done in your research in this period that you want to maybe talk about?
So one of the families that I've been looking at from this period are the Mitford family. So they rise to prominence in kind of the early 1920s. So the oldest sister of the family, Nancy, and she comes of age in 1919, and that's when obviously back then people were doing debutante balls and seasons where they were going out into society. So that's when they first start rising to prominence, because in the 1920s, you've got the bright young things come into prominence, and there are a lot of young people that come of age in the early 20s. And it's interesting, even with the Mitford family. So her father was never the one who was going to inherit the estate and become Baron Resdale. He was actually the younger son, but his brother died in the First World War. So up until 1918, I think it was maybe 1918 that his brother died. They weren't actually set to inherit any money, although they had, you know, generational wealth of stuff. They weren't set to inherit the home that they lived in, which was Astle Manor, and they weren't expecting that. And obviously, with being a lord back then, and I think now, but they might be changing it. Obviously, you have to take your seat in the House of Lords, so that's like something that they weren't expecting, and it just comes with a lot of different responsibilities to not inheriting that title and those responsibilities. And with the Mitfords, the first three of their children born were, or the first two of their children were girls. Then they had only one boy in the whole family out of seven of them. So obviously back then they, you know, you want to have an optimum amount of boys so that you can pass your estates on. So I think by the time they had, I think it was when they had the last girl, it was like, what's the point? Why are we bothering? They weren't very happy about it.
Yeah, I suppose it's the same as it's like a story old as time, really. You know, you want a son and you want a spare, preferably multiple spares.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that is the thing. Like a recurring theme with all of the upper class back then is if they have more than one son, they seem to be a lot happier.
Yeah, because God forbid a woman take control and run things, you know.
I know.
Is there any stories where, while doing your research, where the woman did actually take control? And I'm assuming it would be seen as like a really shocking thing, but like any like powerhouse women you might have come across.
So I haven't come across of anyone like inheriting the estate in their like own right, like in potentially they've been married and then they, you know, they've inherited it as like a couple rather than like an individual woman inherit at that point. But the interesting thing is, like, although like obviously they wanted the men, there's actually loads of accounts of women kind of running like the women ran the houses, the men did nothing to help the household finances, like anything like that. Although, you know, they might have been out working, they weren't the ones who were keeping these large estates going. Like the women were the ones who knew how to keep it running. They had like employed the servants, employed like nannies to help the kids, and all that kind of thing. So I think, although maybe in their own right, they might not have been the owner of the land, and obviously wouldn't have inherited the title, because I think lordships and barons and all that can only be passed to men, as far as I'm aware. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think that's the case. But yeah, I think actually really the women running it. And you can see even with the Mitfords at later on after the Second World War, the youngest sister, Debo, she is married to the Duke of Devonshire, who owns like the Chatsworth House is their family seat,
Oh.
and she's the reason why Chatsworth House actually is successful today, because she put a lot of time and effort into ensuring that that didn't close down, because basically with death duties and stuff, there was a loophole to get out of death duties, and you had to, it was 7 years, so you passed it to your son 7 years before, at least 7 years before your death, and then that meant you didn't have to pay the massive inheritance tax on it, except it went wrong with the Duke of Devonshire, and his father actually died unexpectedly before the 7 years was up. So they had a massive inheritance tax bill. But because of work that Deborah did, it actually is why Chatsworth House is like open to the public now, successful, didn't get ripped down effectively. So I think it's interesting, like women did take on the roles of like making sure these estates succeeded, and she's not the only one who put a lot of time into making sure, you know, their houses weren't ripped down, because it was a possibility with how little money some of them had at some point.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, again, that was just making me think of Downton as well, when they were like, oh, well, we're going to have to up see him, sort of thing. But yeah, that's it's really cool, and I think we don't tend to think about that sort of stuff. That yeah, a lot of these stately homes that are now open to the public, and they are still lived in, didn't start being open to the public until roughly about the 1930s onwards, and that was to try and sort out everything, all the monies from from the war. I think when we think of like the war years, we just think of obviously the actual, I mean, the death and destruction, which is all valid, but especially when it comes to the Second World War, we tend to think of like places being flattened. So like I think that's the one time when we actually focus on the everyday working class people. We just focus on how they've lost everything, their homes have been flattened and stuff, but we forget about how but because of all these other things as well, and relatives being killed, it's caused a knock-on effect with all these other things. And I think that's kind of cool that there's more to unpick than we realise when it comes to these periods.
Yeah, definitely. I think it, like, this period shows everyone is affected by what's going on, not just working class, not just upper class, like everyone, everyone's lives were changing. It's like probably a rare time where everyone's not on level footing, but everyone's going through similar struggles, I think.
Mm. So the other thing we know about, I know it's mostly American based, but when we think about the interwar years as well, that a lot of people think about is to think of the 1920s. So with all the flappers and the getting drunk and doing jazz and stuff. Was that a prominent thing over here? Do you know?
Yeah, so it was definitely part of the culture over here. Probably quite, I guess, quite different in a way to how you would envision it from the American, like, speakeasies, underground drinking scene with gangsters. Obviously, in Britain, drinking was legal,
Mm.
so it wasn't as hidden away as in America. But there definitely was kind of the flapper style over here, and jazz music was definitely popular. And I think a lot of that scene is resting on the socialites. So groups like the Bright Young Things, who were just young people having extravagant parties. That was very much like the big culture of what the newspapers were reporting on in the 20s in Britain. So they just did like crazy things, like go on massive treasure hunts around London and get drunk, and probably, you know, do other things that were going on in America that was illegal in America. But it was just interesting because obviously the papers kind of report on it as like they're very interested in it, the socialites. But I think actually there was a lot of outraged people about how these young people were behaving, because it hadn't really been seen before in the papers in Britain. You know, younger people were expected to act a certain way, and stuff like that. So the fact that people were going out and like drinking and having massive parties was like quite shocking. But obviously a lot of people who were, you know, between the ages of like 18 to 30 around this time have directly experienced World War One. So they've seen either their like siblings or like parents potentially like to war, like their they might not have necessarily gone to war themselves, but someone in their immediate family would have been part of World War One. So it's almost like they have a societal expectation of like, this is how you should act, but actually they've seen so much horror like in the first half of their life that they're like, let's just do something different, let's actually enjoy ourselves. And that's kind of like the papers are reporting on it, I guess not necessarily positively, because the papers are never positive, but they are almost obsessed with these people. And people like Cecil Beaton, who is a famous, has a lot of photography in the National Gallery and stuff like that. He takes a lot of photos of them. So then therefore they get even more famous because there's so much photos, I guess, on like a relatively new thing by this point. They're only 100 and so years old. They're much easier to print now. So they're just getting way more famous because of how people can capture them. So yeah, there's just loads of partying going on. And I think working class people did go to clubs and stuff like that. And kind of similar to America, like there was a bit of a like, I guess, gangster vibe going on because where people realized they can make money selling alcohol to America. And gambling was illegal in Britain apart from for racing, like horse racing. So people, that was a big underground scene in Britain, especially at race courses. So there is like kind of, it's nowhere near as bad as like Al Capone or anything like that, but there is like dodgy goings on as well.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So yeah, so at least we're not being left out. You know, we're getting to experience the American way, sort of thing. Because it's the one thing I do find the most interesting when it comes to history is we tend to bounce between, especially once America starts really taking off as its own country. We kind of bounce between this is what was happening in Britain, but this is what was happening in America, and it kind of like bounces between the two. So you kind of, I just wanted to know if there was like any like overlap with that sort of thing, as you just said. So yeah, that's depressing because of the whole gangster side of it, but also kind of cool that we had it on this end as well.
Yeah, I think like you don't expect kind of Britain in the past to have much. Not, I think we think of ourselves as quite uptight, don't we? And not, wouldn't necessarily do some of the things that are, but actually people did want to have a good time in the 1920s and to like obviously into the 30s, like the mood was changing in the country, but in the 1920s people just want to forget about the past 5 years. So obviously people are having a good time, but it's just that we're way more uptight, so we don't talk about it as much.
Yeah, it's just genuinely really interesting because I know another thing that happened in regards to America 1920s was this is when new technologies come onto the scene and to make looking after the home more convenient comes onto the scene. So like vacuums and things have been a thing for a while by this point, but it's now becoming more commonplace to have like electricals in your home and stuff that are meant to make things easier, quote unquote easier. It didn't, it made things worse. But all these like new conveniences were coming onto the scene. And I'm assuming the same thing probably happened over here as well, because like those sort of stuff was happening, coming over probably.
Yeah, so I think obviously it was a time of like invention, I guess, and people, yeah, new things coming along. But I think actually when you look at, say, the upper class, they were very like reluctant to, well, not all of them, obviously, but there's a lot of upper class families that would think, you know, having a telephone in the house was completely mental or anything like along those lines. Like people, I think people were very old fashioned, especially in the upper class. So they would keep their servants on and things like that, when really if they'd actually adapted some of the new things they probably could have done a few things even easier, but it was almost like, no, we've been doing this way for hundreds of years, let's continue, let's not adapt. So I think, yeah, and also I guess with the lack of money a lot of people were facing in the 20s, because I know obviously when you get to the end of the 1920s in America especially, obviously there's the Wall Street crash and it leads into like the Great Depression, and obviously the Britain was heavily affected by this, but I think also World War One did hit Britain a lot harder than say it hit America. So I think people were in the US just because obviously we spent more money on the First World War than what America did. So I think a lot of people, even if they were interested in inventions, might not necessarily have been able to afford it in the same way as Americans, because Americans had a bit more money.
Yeah. Well, that comes very apparent with the Second World War, because with the Second World War, because like you said, they were going through a depression because of the crash of Wall Street and things like that. But in all fairness, the Second World War actually, as horrible as it sounds, but the Second World War worked in America's favour. Work in our favour, but it worked in America's favour because suddenly they're like, oh, we can make bombs, we can make stuff, we can make money from all this sort of suffering and destruction.
Yeah, it's a big industry, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So when did you first start getting into this period? Was it something like learnt at school and you were like, oh, I want to look into this more, or did you see a program or a book or something? What got you wanting to be into this period?
So I'd say at school definitely didn't really do much on maybe like a bit on like votes for women, which is kind of like earlier than this, but obviously it kind of continues onwards a bit.
Yeah.
But I'd say when I was doing my master's degree, I was doing a lot of research on different topics, because obviously you do lots of different seminars and stuff like that. And I just was like researching a bit about this period, and I just was finding it so interesting. So then that led me to reading a bit more, and then like watching a bit more, and just realizing like, oh, this is really interesting. And yeah, just kind of went from there. So I guess, yeah, like just learning, I guess at uni you do so many different things that eventually you're like, oh, this is the one.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. And what did you do at uni? I'm assuming you did a history degree?
Yeah, so for my undergraduate degree, I actually did film production, but what
Oh,
I did a master's in, I did a master's in European history, because I realized once I graduated from film, I was like, actually, I want to pursue the history as well. So I thought they work nicely together. It's fine.
yeah. I suppose that must be interesting as well. Like seeing or like films from the European standpoint, it would be quite interesting as well because of how the interwar period must have affected them as well.
Yeah, I think like there's definitely a lot of crossover between film and this period, because obviously films were becoming, well, I guess before 1920, like I think films were invented in like 1901 or something like that. I can't remember the exact date. But obviously by 1920, they were becoming popular propaganda, um, literally used to try and like influence the public. Obviously, it was entertainment, but the further you get into the 1920s and 1930s, the more it is propaganda for people. So it's actually really interesting to look at, because all the different countries have different things that they're trying to tell their country about. Obviously, you can imagine Germany, horrible propaganda. Like other countries, I mean, some countries had stricter rules. I mean, obviously, we know Spain was fascist under Franco at this time. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that come out of Spain, or like after that as well. Like there's just so much going on during this period. Like everyone has such different tastes in film. So it's actually really interesting to like look at them all.
Yeah, I watched a film recently, or I quickly went through one, to do with the the Russian Revolution. So the actual revolution itself, when it happened, basically the doors were just left open, and they walked in and were like, oh, okay, well, we'll might as well get drunk then, because nobody was there. But under, I think it was under Stalin, I think there were. He wanted to kind of cement this moment when things changed. So he asked for a film to be made. I think this was in 1928, I think it was. They made a film called, I think it's called 1917, and it's a very over dramatized version of them storming the Winter Palace and then taking over revolution and that. And I just thought it was really interesting because that in itself is also propaganda. But it's really cool that this medium is being used as a way of going, look at us, aren't we so great? We've done these things, or people are going to be doing this to us, or whatever it is they're needing to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that continues like even up until like today. Like there's a lot of propaganda in films, or like showcasing like when you see a bad guy in a film and they've got a certain accent, that's like the filmmaker trying to show like this country's bad for us or whatever. Like there's even like certain tools that they used back then are still used today because it's just like such a popular way to kind of get messages across. So I find it like interesting. And I think Russia, like, yeah, they had so much propaganda films, didn't they? They loved it.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually got told, I don't know if you know this, but I got told by a colleague of mine who really likes down the rabbit hole of old random films, and she told me that apparently there is a version of the Titanic which is propaganda, and it was the Germans redoing Titanic and made it. I don't know how they turned it into some propaganda, but yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
I mean, I can't imagine what they would be doing with it, but it sounds like it would be an interesting watch. I don't know what the message would be, but
I think maybe that the Germans were great at something. I think maybe in their version all the Germans survived. I don't even know if there was any Germans on the Titanic, but yeah, very, very interesting. If I find out what it's called, I'll send it to you. But
it sounds interesting.
yeah. So not only are you interested in history and you did a filming degree, but you also work for the Historians magazine.
Yes, yep, I do.
Yeah, and what's that like? What's that like working for the magazine, especially as I'm taking it that's up your street 'cause it's film, history, all in one.
Sorry, I don't know if it was my Wi-Fi, but you cut out on the just a second ago. Could you just repeat what you said? I think it might be me, but it just audio went.
So I was basically saying, I was asking you, what is it like working for the Historians magazine, and with the fact that the Historians magazine has a YouTube channel, I'm assuming that's really up your street because it's a mixture of film and history all nicely merged into one.
Yeah, so it's great doing the work for the Historians magazine. Obviously our main aim is to like publish new writers, so that's like really rewarding because you get to work with loads of different people and get loads of different work out there, which is cool because there's like always different things coming in. So that's like a really cool part. And then yeah, the YouTube is really fun. We filmed a few documentaries this year that were really fun to do. So we actually went to France and filmed one like D-Day beaches and like D-Day locations because this year was the 80th anniversary, and then we also went to the Bay Tapestry and had like an hour alone with the Bay Tapestry to film,
Oh, wow.
which was really cool. So that's kind of like the ones, and we also did like a really mini documentary on Joan of Arc, but we weren't quite in the right area of France for it. We were in Rouen, which is where she was I think it's Rouen where she's executed or somewhere around there. So we were like where the execution spot was, but obviously the rest of Joan of Arc is quite spread across different areas of France. So that one was a very mini. We just were there and we're like, oh, let's do something. But yeah, so it's really fun to do that. And we have plans to do more documentaries because I think they're just an easy way for people to get into history as well. Like, although reading the magazine is great, if people aren't as keen on reading, like we wanted another avenue to showcase like history to people. And I think obviously filming is very visual, like a lot going on. I think it's like a nice way to do it. So we've got a few plans for next year. We just don't know which one to do first.
That's fair. I suppose as well, when you see documentaries, I think in a weird way it's like more relatable in some weird way, because I suppose more relatable and more tangible as well, to be able to see it and just like, oh, so this is the place, this is the person, this is the whatever.
Yeah, says like, I mean, obviously France seems like it's far away, but actually like it only took us a couple of hours to where we were. And um like it shows that you can easily go and see history yourself, I guess, because and a lot of the ones that we're planning for future ones will be in the UK, because obviously the France one was mostly because it was D-Day. So like most of them will be potentially where, you know, near where people will live, that people will have heard of. So just like trying to showcase like this is like all around you, like you can go see it yourself.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool. Do you, while working with the magazine, I bet you get some interesting stories with your period of interest. Do you ever go, oh, I may have to research that more, or I might have to keep that aside?
Yeah, I think that's like the difficult thing, isn't it? Because then you think, oh, that's a great idea, but yeah, you kind of I mean, I just, and also you're more drawn towards ideas maybe that are your own interest area, also because you know a bit more about it. So when people like submit things, luckily there's like three of us that go through and select, and we all have different interests, because a lot of the time you're like, oh, I've never heard of this is so interesting, and then the person who's like a medie is like, this has been done a million times, you're like, okay, like I don't know what I'm doing. So yeah, it's like kind of hard to, when you see things that you're interested in, you automatically want to say yes, oh, let's do this, let's make this massive, and then you're like, no, scale back, you just need to like not go overboard with it, like select it if it's good, and not just because you want to research it yourself. So that's the hard part. But yeah, it's good seeing things you're interested in, because it does make you think, oh, that's great.
That's really, really cool. So, to share about either your job or about your subject matter?
Sorry, my audio went again. I think it's my headphones. Can you just repeat that bit? Sorry.
Yeah, so I was just asking, so we're going to be probably going to be coming just to an end in a bit. Is there anything else you want to share with people, either about your job at History Magazine, or if you can any potential stuff of what might be happening next year, or anything to do with your period of interest, if you can?
Yeah, so I guess with the Historians magazine, we've got loads of things planned for next year. I mean, my personal aim is that I want to make a documentary about the Mitford sisters. Next year there's actually like a period drama coming out about them. So it's like
Oh,
people might start getting really interested in them, and I want to like go to all the locations before
do it,
maybe
do it,
before they
do it.
become too popular. So that's hopefully next year's plan. It's just finding the time to get it done before it potentially is too busy in the summer and stuff like that, because filming in the summer is just hard work because everyone's out. And then yeah, we've got some really cool topics coming up. We're not doing like themes with the magazine, but we've got really cool articles that we've selected for like the first edition of 2025. So there's lots of like different range, you know, medieval, ancient, loads of different things in that one. So that's like going to be really cool. And yeah, we do have lots of ideas. We just need the time to execute them all. So hopefully we'll have lots of exciting things coming. And I would say, oh, I'm going to post loads of stuff about the interwar period on my Instagram, and you know, tell everyone all about it, but I can't promise that. So if you see me posting it, great. If you don't, then we'll just pretend I've never said it.
That's fair. Oh, well, good luck to you for next year. I hope you do get a chance to do your documentary, because by the sounds of it, it would tie in so perfectly with the drama, because you'd be like, oh, you know this drama that's been on TV? Well, that I got a chance to go see. So I think that'd be really cool. So,
yeah, everyone will be going to all the locations once we do it, you know.
Yeah, so you need to be there first and be like, yeah, we were there when nobody knew about these places.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I will have to let you go now, but it's been really lovely talking to you. Sorry again for the delay at the beginning of this podcast. But it's been really lovely talking to you, and I do wish you all the best with your future projects. And thank you for sharing your interest with me today.
Thank you. It's been good fun. I mean, when is it not fun to talk about history? So, no.
Very true. Where can people find you, or if you've done any work or anything, can anybody find that?
Yeah, so the magazine is the Historians magazine. I think we're on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. They're like the main ones. And we have a website, which is thehistoriansmagazine.com. And I'm History of Rosie. I'm mostly just on Instagram. So yeah.
Okay, I'll make sure to link all that down below so people can try and find you. So yeah, thank you again, Rosie, for being on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.